just like the United States wouldn't like to see a kind of a military bloc on the border between the US and Mexico or the US and Canada. So we understand that, and we think it was a it was a very natural and correct position to oppose it, and that Russia did make a lot of attempts to actually warn them and request them and appeal that NATO should, this is that one red line. So India and many of these countries along with India have understood this, and they don't see any evidence of Putin or Russia actually being aggressive, but they can see that evidence from the US and NATO, where the US has intervened in 64 countries of the global south primarily.
Hello, everybody. This is Pascal from Neutrality Studies, and today I'm talking to a fellow academic from India's Jawaharlal Nehru University, Professor Anuradha Chenoy. She's a specialist of international affairs who has worked for decades, especially on Russia, human security, arms trade, and peace building, and she's also working with the International Peace Bureau, and she's a fellow at the Transnational Institute in the Netherlands. Anu, thank you very much for coming online today.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, Pascal.
Very welcome. I'm really glad that we could organize this talk, because we were sitting on a meeting of the Peace Bureau the other day, and you were making a lot of very good points about the current system that we are living in. And I really wanted to talk to you about your views, especially also from India, toward what is happening currently with these two horrific wars that we have seen popping up, right? 1.5 years, almost 2 years ago, the one in between Russia and Ukraine, and you have worked and written books about Russia and Russia's development and policy. So I wanted to get your insights on that one, and then of course, and in the second part also about what has been happening over the last 6 weeks in Israel and Palestine. Maybe let me start with topic number one. So since the beginning of the special military operation, as the Russians call it, the war in Ukraine, as the West is calling it, we have seen a lot of development, especially in the non-aligned world. And India, of course, back in the day, was a leader of non-alignment, and we have seen again that India has been taking a very independent stance in international affairs toward Europe. How have you seen India's foreign policy developing over the last 2 years? What's most remarkable to you that needs to be noticed?
Well, I think India's foreign policy coincides with, of course, several domestic trends. One is that it is an emerging economy. Its growth is comparatively very fast. There is a new political and economic elite. It is a very neoliberal kind of economy, but also with a certain amount of social welfare spending. But it has its constraints. India has a huge population, and they have to manage it. So there are certain continuities in foreign policy and certain changes. I think where India has positioned itself is it finds that this emerging multipolarity is exactly how they would like to see the international system constructed. So they don't just see multipolarity as a given, but that they have an agency in constructing it because it suits them geopolitically, like it suits a lot of countries in the global south. And we can talk about the global south in a while. But specifically about India, they feel that with this, they can leverage different great and emerging powers. For example, in the last few years, India has, unlike in the past, built a strategic relationship with the United States. When it was part of the non-aligned movement, its voice was heard because of its collectivity with the other non-aligned countries, but they didn't really matter when it came to any international decision making. And India, along with South Africa and Brazil, when they became these emerging economies and fast-growing economies, they became a bit different than the rest of the global South, which was indebted or low income. Of course, India is also extremely unequal. So it's not that they're completely out of these traps, which they still have internally. But overall, they feel that their voice as leaders of the global South should matter in international bodies, whether it's the Security Council, the World Bank, the IMF, where all it's weighted in favor of the North and what we call the former colonial countries, and therefore this trend of a continuation where they continue to be the drivers of international decision making, whereas these countries with large populations, with now independent and fairly sustainable economies, still do not have a voice. And that is why, of course, India built its strategic relations with the United States. They've always had fairly decent relations with the EU, but they've had extremely close relations with Russia. And during the non-aligned period, very often when countries described India, they would say that they're actually not non-aligned because they are too socialist and they're too close to Russia, the Soviet Union, which wasn't really accurate. But if you want to simplify things, because India did have a mixed economy, a public sector supported quite a lot by the Soviet Union in the beginning years, the large infrastructure industries like steel and etc. But and its foreign policy is sympathetic to what the Soviet positions were, because they were the ones that were supporting national liberation movements in the global South. The national liberation movements had their own history. India always was part of the anti-apartheid struggles in South Africa very strongly. They've supported the two-state or a solution to Palestine and have been with Palestine since the very beginning. But now, currently, they're in a position where they're balancing much more because they want to gain from technology from the US, and they don't see Russia as a threat as the Europeans do. They see it as a very benign partner who's been very steadfast with India all these years. Now, in India's foreign policy, there are two major issues on the border. India's border is huge and part of South Asia, but traditionally they've had a problem with Pakistan, who claims part of Indian territory, that's Kashmir, and they have often used the instrument of terrorism to weaken India, in which they have not been successful. India has moved far ahead and has been able to manage that. And China, who claims also part of the border, and the fact that China and Pakistan are very close partners. And what India felt was part of its territory was actually given by Pakistan to China. So it's a very difficult and not an easy border situation. These are frozen conflicts which flare up time to time. In the last 5 years, there have been episodes with China where they've been managed episodes. They've not gone out of hand. No other power has had to intervene, but there have been border clashes. So the relations between India and China remain kind of cold, and I think the US sees that as an opportunity. As the US is expanding in and militarizing in the Indo-Pacific or the Asia-Pacific, as some call it, they need stronger partners to contain China. And they see India as a potential partner. Now, India, given the fact that it also wants its own strategic autonomy, I think they've been quite adept at playing off the US at certain points. And I don't think they would not like to completely align with the US or the EU in its foreign policy, because ultimately they have their own national interests. India has its very distinct national interests. So while they would like to gain, while they support, some of the maritime issues of security in the Indo-Pacific, they would not like to be really caught in any deep conflict or contradiction between the US and China either.
Mm-hmm.
They would like to show their neutrality in that.
There was a very interesting clip of about a year ago when your foreign minister was at a large international relations discussion event, something, and he was interviewed by the host, who said, like, when push comes to shove, who are you going to choose, Russia or the United States? Because you have to be one or the other. And he very, very clearly said, no, this is not how it works. India. He literally said, I represent about a fifth of the world population. I think I'm entitled to my own position. But that argument was very hard for the anchor, for the interviewer to actually even process. And she said, yeah, but we know the world is binary and you have to choose. It's really interesting that this is so hard for certain, especially neoconservatives in the United States, to understand that you can be neither, or you can be a third. You can have your own foreign policy. And what you're saying about China is interesting, because I thought that, especially when it comes to China, India would like to side with the United States much more because it helps with the balancing. But you're saying even with China, India would prefer some support, but definitely not being a hard ally of the US.
Absolutely. Though I don't speak for Indian foreign policy, I'm not part of the regime at all, but it's a very clear sense I get that, because this is part of Indian history, that they don't have this concept that Western discourse has of either or, or a binary concept. And that was what the non-aligned movement was about, that we don't want to be part of either bloc, either military bloc. You can see that, for example, in Vietnam's foreign policy. Vietnam's actually had a war with China. They're very similar with India. And so India's relations with Vietnam are very close. But they also have these 4 no's, which is not same as India, but they also say that we don't want to be part of any clear containment. And you can see that in ASEAN. You can see that in almost all the global South, except for a few exceptions, like South Korea and others. who tend to be more aligned with the positions of the US and NATO.
Yeah.
But India would like, you can see that what happened in the Ukraine conflict. India's position since 2014 has been genuinely empathetic to the Russian position that NATO should not expand to Russia's border. In 2014, India was one of the countries which supported the secession of Crimea. They said it's fine. It's there on the records. So
this is very interesting because this issue of NATO expansion and Crimea is so hard for Europeans to wrap their head around and to understand, because they're so deeply, and I mean Europeans and the collective West, that has completely, utterly, 100% swallowed the argument that NATO is purely defensive, has never done anything evil ever, and is really only here to protect the defenseless Europeans, right? And B, that Putin is crazy when he looks at that as a threat. So absolutely crazy. But you're saying that in India, you very intuitively actually understand that no, this is NATO at the border of Russia. That's a problem. You see that, right?
Exactly, because for example, we wouldn't like to see an alliance of 20 or 30 countries with nuclear arms on our border. We wouldn't like to have missiles within 10 minutes of, even if we are a nuclear power. Just like the United States wouldn't like to see a kind of a military bloc on the border between the US and Mexico, or the US and Canada. So we understand that, and we think it was it was a very natural and correct position to oppose it, and that Russia did make a lot of attempts to actually warn them and request them and appeal that NATO this is that one red line. So India and many of these countries along with India have understood this, and they don't see any evidence of Putin or Russia actually being aggressive, but they can see that evidence from the US and NATO, where the US has intervened in 64 countries of the global south primarily, a few in the north also, bombing of Serbia, etc. And sanctions, the three pillars which are important in multilateralism for India and much of the global south is: one, they collectively oppose unilateral economic measures or sanctions. And in the global south, about 80 countries have been sanctioned, including India at one point, by the US. Second, they want a strategic autonomy. Earlier, many countries didn't feel it was possible because of this especially in West Asia, and you can see the shifting politics in the Middle East or West Asia, where the Arab countries now have got this sense that there is an alternative possible. Just the US, which was a security provider and mediated in West Asian conflicts with each other, now they feel there's a possibility. There's China, there's Russia. They don't see any threat from Russia or China. They've been partners with Russia in OPEC+. China has the Belt and Road Initiative with, I think, 17 Arab countries, Islamic countries. So they do not see this as a threat. And so more of them are actually intuitively, instinctively, and in terms of their own state realist politics, they're following this path that strategic autonomy helps them develop. It helps them that their national interest is not the US national interest, even though the US covers it in terms of, rules or values or human rights. But below that, this has been shattered during the Israel conflict, and especially this war and how they've reacted to the Hamas terrorist attacks after 7. The whole discourse is framed so differently now by the South, of course, but also by the global, what's come out as a global majority.
Right. I wonder about that, and we will talk about Palestine and Israel in a second. But, you know, if we look at the Cold War setup that we had, you had the West, NATO, and you had then the other bloc, Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact, right? And then you've had the non-aligned movement, but the non-aligned movement took a long time to develop it, and it took a long time to it's still a very loose coalition, right? There is no permanent secretariat. It's not comparable to what BRICS is developing into today, and the non-aligned movement is still around. But one big difference that I can see emerge, because a lot of people talk now about the new Cold War, and that's kind of a disingenuous, not a very smart way of looking at what currently is developing, because we are not really going to have these two rivaling blocks. What we have is one block, the West, that then opposes basically everybody else, but in very, very different ways. It opposes China, very different from Russia, and it also opposes all of the still non-aligned countries. I mean, it still does with Cuba what it always has been doing with Cuba, which is basically trying to strangle it to death, right, economically. But also with Africa, we can see how the US and European countries are highly still neo-colonial. Not only neo-colonial, they're becoming classical colonial again, as in trying to tell Niger trying to tell everybody what to do, right? And certain coup regimes it supports, other coup regimes it cries foul, oh, democracy. That we know that, if you support something like Egypt, then you're not really into democracy. We know that. But what I can see at the moment is just like one bloc developing, and the whole rest of the world basically trying to do their own thing. And also, if you look at the voting behavior at the United Nations, Ben Norton recently pointed out, increasingly it's the West against the rest. So in a sense, we are developing really in a divided world, but it's the West against everybody else, and everybody else seems to be really fed up. Is that a sense that you get in India, that this with international relations, that people get fed up with this collective West approach?
Well, I get that sense definitely, because I read the press from Africa, Latin America, ASEAN, etc. But as far as the Indian regime is concerned, they're just looking at narrow Indian national interest and how they project it. So there seems to be a kind of a bipolarity in their own thinking, where they all, on the one hand, they want to be the voice in the global South. There cannot be any one voice. It's uncoordinated, unstructured. These are countries which have had 3 or 4 centuries of colonialism, and so their level of thinking and development, they still have not been able to catch up. India is in a hurry to catch up with the West, and so they negotiate closer with the West. But at the same time, they want to be part of the global South and a voice of the global South, and BRICS is coming up as that. But BRICS also has Russia and China, which are not really the global South, and therefore this terminology has changed to global majority, which was, I think, something which Lukashenko of Belarus first said, and now it's become common. So on the one hand, the global South is not exactly, is part of a global majority, but they're not fully also aligned just with Russia and China. They know that Russia and China cannot just be their voice. They all have to have their individual kind of interests also. And so, of course, there is very clearly in the UN in how they react and how they will react now to new interventions, there will be a global majority. Whether, for example, there's any new intervention, it's not like the past, like in Iraq or in Lebanon or Libya, where the dominant hegemonic press was able to get away with this discourse. Now it's going to be challenged from this global solidarity street, where people come out and they question their own leaders also if they don't take a position which is not anti-colonial. And you're right, there is a new scramble for Africa. Mm-hmm. It's different, but there is a new scramble for the commodity-rich global South in different ways. If you're very astute and you study the past, you can see similarities, but the scramble is there. Why is there so much interest in India or in Africa or in Venezuela again? But this is not the same kind of interest. Earlier, the scramble was primarily from the European states and then from the US. Now the scramble is also from Russia and China and also from India.
Yeah. The funny thing is that the people who cry foul the loudest, oh, debt trap, are the countries that debt trapped Africa and other developing nations for the last 70, 80 years. It's so hypocritical that they now go like, oh, China cannot do investments because they're evil. They only debt trap these countries. And it's like, no, dude, no. I mean, A, it's very hypocritical. B, that's not really what's happening. But it does occur to me now that something that we never hear by either the West or also others is countries who say like, hey, we will help you develop your industries, because one of the largest problems is countries that do not have their own indigenous industries and cannot have national independence when it comes to goods and services, right? How do you see India's role in this new way of interacting with other developing nations?
Well, I think an interesting case study would be actually to see the kind of development assistance that the BRICS countries have with other countries which are indebted, etc., where they have kind of given debt relief, and they have a package which is not foreign aid. They don't believe in foreign aid because they feel that's not dignified. That kind of assistance, that it has conditionalities that we'll give you, like even the World Bank does. We'll give you foreign aid if you have austerity, or we'll give you foreign aid if you change your internal system. India, China, Brazil, etc., they do not intervene in domestic issues wherever they're giving assistance. They see it as a partnership. And in that, it's a package where there are loans, there are grants, there's humanitarian assistance, and there's development. So the loans are easy loans which have to be repaid also. So there's a difference between how the terms of trade are set. It should not be like Nigeria's lithium deposits, which France was buying at such cheap rates, which Niger's, which led to that expulsion and
exploitation.
It was exploitation, and so it led to they want France out of the region, and they're saying China can come. So is it one type of exploitation going to replace another? No, because they feel that China or India or maybe South Africa, their terms of trade are in a more fair way, that they're not that exploitative.
Do you have any information on the tip of your mind, like what India, China's, and in China's like development aid is denominated in? Is it denominated in your local the local currencies, or is it in US dollars, or in the recipient's currency?
Now, this is a very interesting question that you have raised. Now, what has happened is that it's like all kinds of things. Initially, the development assistance from India, at least, initially was at least denominated in dollars, because the exchange rate is such in India that when they do this trade, it is in dollars. But recently, in the past few years, India, just like China and Russia, especially after the sanctions on Russia, the rupee trade is getting a lot of attention, and there's a lot of focus and attempt to engage in trade in national currencies. So India now has these, what they call the Vostro accounts, where the countries they're trading with, which are a lot of the ASEAN countries, even the UAE and some of the West Asian countries and Russia and others, they set up this account in Indian banks sanctioned by the Indian Reserve Bank, and there is a currency swap also, and a kind of a barter like India had with the Soviet Union for years. They did a rupee-ruble trade. So India is more adept at it than any other country. For years, they did the rupee-ruble trade. It was set at a particular rate. And India was buying Soviet oil and now Russian oil with rupees.
Mm-hmm.
But there are problems within that, more than that I've seen with the yuan, the trade with the yuan. The problem with the Indian rupee and ruble trade, for example, is that Russia has accumulated billions of Indian rupees, which
because you buy much more oil from them than they
sell. They're buying things
you.
From us, though they're. So the Indian government at the highest levels apparently is working out how the Russians can invest back in the Indian economy as soon as the sanctions are loosened. Now, India has become a hub for oil, because the oil comes from Russia and it goes to Europe after being
washed.
After clean.
Yeah. No, but the reason why I ask this is it sounds like a technicality, but the trade currencies are hugely important, because this is how the United States managed not only to be on top of its game for the past 100 years, it's also how it indebted all these other countries. It's not that it gives these countries money for free, it gives them US dollars, and what can you buy with US dollars? US denominated goods, or goods on the world market denominated in US dollars, right? So you create a system which is so focused around you that if you break that up, it will A, diminish US structural influence, and B, it will make things more complicated. That's the problem with these currency swaps. They're really hard to do, and you run into other problems. Like now, if Russia ever decided that it wants to hurt the Indian economy, it just floods the world market with rupees, right? And the rupee falls, and that has detrimental effects on your import and export markets, right? But it depends which one you're more structurally dependent upon. But that is a problem, and countries are naturally hesitant to do that, right? So,
right. So what I'm saying is, what India's position on this is, there is all this talk about de-dollarization. So they don't believe that it's really de-dollarization. The dollar will remain as a major currency, but it's part of like a multipolar economic system. That is the basis for the multipolar economic system. The fact that there can be bilateral trade in national currencies also, but you also can peg your currency vis-a-vis the US dollar. So you're not getting rid of the dollar, you're using that also, but so it's a multi-economic system where you have trade with several countries, and India is engaging in that trade with national currencies, with within South Asia, not with Pakistan, of course, or China, but with ASEAN countries, with West Asian countries, with some African countries. So the rupee is being used as a currency. It's very small at the moment because India has not gone in for a free exchange, and that's the strength of the dollar. It's something you can use anywhere, but that's not the case with the Indian rupee or even the yuan at the moment.
Maybe sorry.
So it's a process which has started, which was not there historically. So this is a new historical process, which is part of the politics of also the global South, but also the global majority.
Yeah, rising in currency sovereignty. So this is why it's going to be, I think, if the new Argentinian president goes through with his promise to get rid of the Argentinian pesos and adopt the US dollar, we will see how that experiment will go. I don't predict anything good for them if they do that. I really think it would be a huge mistake, but fine, we're going to see one country doing the opposite of the other developing nations and see what the result will be. But maybe one last question in this segment. BRICS, where's BRICS going? How do you see India, China, Russia, and the others, and now with the expansion? Do you see more formalization? Will there be at some point a permanent secretariat? How will BRICS develop?
Well, BRICS now has become literally the original BRICS plus many of the OPEC countries.
Oil.
And oil. And that was one of the reasons why India was all for it, apparently, because of the possibilities of trade within that. And BRICS is, I think, an extremely important formation. There are a lot of countries which would like to join it. Of course, many of them have their own contradictions. After all, India and China, they have deep contradictions, but they work together in BRICS. And BRICS has many different forums, by the way. Academic forum, the women's forum, forum on trade, forum on energy. So through the year also, these other forums keep meeting. There are the BRICS universities, which I know of. There are the BRICS women. There's a BRICS youth. So it's broken into small things. Whether it has a permanent secretary, the New Development Bank is a very important initiative.
By China.
In China, and the Asia Infrastructure, these two banks which deal in Asia Infrastructure Bank, which deal in national currency. 50% of their loans are and grants are in national currencies, and 50% in euro or dollar. So you can see how that's playing out, and they're working on methodologies which would enable this precisely, where this whole fear that there will be one currency is completely wrong. It will just be mechanisms to facilitate trade in national currencies, which will make it easier. And one of the reasons it's happened is, of course, because of the dollar hegemony. Second, because of these economic the coercive economic measures, the sanctions. And the countries of the global South are tired of these sanctions being put on them for anything that they do. And third, it gives them this strategic autonomy, and it gives them a neutrality. So they're not tied by the apron strings of the US dollar. If they want to take a position like India did, for example, of being completely neutral on the Russia-Ukraine war and taking oil. So they said they were neutral, but essentially they abstained every time there was any negative resolution against Russia in the United Nations or in the Security Council. Of course, they want to give humanitarian aid to Ukraine, etc. and that's part of it. But this is the new neutrality, which is very different than the old, quite different from the old non-aligned. You would know.
Yeah, this is highly interesting. This is why I look at it so deeply, because I do think the most important development in terms of like neutrality policy is happening right now in the global south. Actually, the Europeans are even Switzerland, they're absolutely incapable of thinking outside of any kind of traditional box, and actually they're getting caught right now. You know, NATO has been very successful at catching them ideologically, and it's dragging them away the way it dragged Sweden and Finland away. But India is not playing along, and the global south is not playing along, and I'm very, very happy to see that. It's a much smarter policy. Also, that what you're saying, that India's policy is based upon Indian interests, because you can see how the West is using this very abstract term of values, and I don't think that a value-based foreign policy is a good idea, because countries are geographically bound, and they are bound by very real constraints, and a focus on those constraints is a much better guide to what is good for the people within that geographical territory, which is still the system we're living in.
You're absolutely right. But there are certain values which everyone shares. Right to life, certain universal values, and everyone's grateful to the West for having envisioned these. But there are a lot of cultural differences. And yes. For example, the right to be different is a right which I think should be part of the human rights and value discourse.
Yeah.
The right to be different, and the right, which is not accepted by the West, because they would like everyone to follow the Western trajectory. And you know, especially living in Japan, how culturally different countries are, and how they hold on to these cultural differences, to the idea of their own community, etc. So I think one has to respect that, and that's not part of this discourse. And also, you can see intervention and pushing all countries to be the same kind of democracies has not really worked. Sanctions have, of course, they've impoverished Cuba, as you mentioned, but it has not bent them. It's only promoted migration, etc. But it's really time to rethink these things. So therefore, I think that is the reason why the Global South is going to stick to neutrality at the minimum. They want the choice to decide whether they want to support a US containment or an expansion in Indo-Pacific, or they want to stay out of it, or they want to support the other side. That's neutrality, the right to choice.
Exactly, you're putting it very well. The right to choose, and the possibility to choose what you want to do based upon what makes sense right now, and not 10 years ago, and not in a hypothetical future, but right now.